Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 225. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Kurt Deion about his book, Presidential Grave Hunter: One Kid's Quest to Visit the Tombs of Every President and Vice President. Kurt was just 9 years old when he told his parents he wanted to visit the gravesites of all the U.S. presidents. His parents were happy to support him, and they traveled around the country, visiting presidential libraries, cemeteries, and other interesting locales. Pretty soon, his quest expanded to include the vice presidents and the first ladies as well. Presidential Grave Hunter includes Kurt's impressions of the presidential tombs, stories of his escapades to reach some of the more out-of-the-way gravesites, and fond memories of his family trips. While on this decade-long quest, Kurt's love of history grew, and he is now an education specialist at the historic Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. His quests aren't over, however. He is currently working on visiting the gravesites of the U.S. Supreme Court Justices and the Baseball Hall of Famers. In this episode, I'll chat with Kurt about his writing journey, what he believes each president brings to the office, and how he learned to tune out other people's opinions and stay true to his mission, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Kurt Deion, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Stacey.
I thought what we could do today is talk about your new book, Presidential Grave Hunter: One Kid's Quest to Visit the Tombs of Every President and Vice President. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, I had an interesting childhood, and a number of people told me you should write a book about it. So eventually I did. That was Presidential Grave Hunter. I was interested in presidents and presidential history as a young kid, and then I started going to the different historic sites, their houses, their presidential libraries and museums, and particularly their tombs. And that was something that just really captivated me. I started going to all of the tombs and grave sites over time. I threw in the vice presidents as well. Of course, most of the first ladies are also buried next to the presidents. I couldn't include them in the title because I felt like the book title was long enough already. But the first ladies are touched upon as well. And it was a great learning experience growing up, and it was something that I wanted to share with the public, again, after some prodding from some friends and whatnot. And my goal was to not only share my story, but also to try to inspire other people to engage in hands-on history, going to the actual sites where these historic events or happened or the historical figures lived, and the grave hunting, as we call it.
In your bio, I read that you asked your dad to help you on this quest at age 9.
Yes.
That seems awfully young to have decided that you wanted to tackle something so enormous. What was his reaction?
His reaction was, I'm going to support my son. And that was my mother's reaction as well. She was not able to be as hands-on with the hands-on history because of her more traditional work situation as opposed to my father. But both of them have always been very supportive of my sister Olivia and myself and whatever missions, quests we wanted to do in life. And this was mine at age 9, and they made it possible to go travel across the country and visit these different presidential sites. A lot of people think, oh, aren't all the presidents and first ladies just buried in Arlington National Cemetery? That's something that I've encountered in my book circuit, if you will, traveling and visiting some of the different places. I go, no, they're actually spread out across the presidents across 18 different states and Washington, D.C. Then if you throw in the first ladies and the vice presidents, it grows even larger. So it was quite an undertaking, and I'm just really thankful that I had their support, because otherwise I could not have done so starting at age 9. I couldn't even drive myself to these places, of course.
Yeah. And how about friends? Other, your friends growing up, when they found out that this was this was your quest, this was the mission you were on, did they think it was cool? Did they understand? Did you have to do a lot of explaining?
Well, that's bold of you to assume I had friends, Stacey. Like, uh, I,
Yeah.
it was always, it was an interesting experience growing up. It was sometimes difficult to make friends, not just for the reason of visiting cemeteries, but for other things. My friends who I had, we kind of bonded over other things. Being able to bond or connect with people over the cemetery and history visits wasn't something that really happened with me until I reached adulthood, per se, and was able to find some other people. So my friends that I had, I think maybe just kind of ignored it. So uh, I guess appreciative of that in a way. I mean, as opposed to not wanting to be friends because of it, at least.
Okay. Well, what I'd like to do, if you could bear with me here, is you've obviously visited a lot of these grave sites. So I'd like to go through, for lack of a better word, some superlatives, because I'd like your take on what you saw and your impressions of the presidents, and how their grave sites, how their tombstones reflect maybe who they were, or don't reflect who they were. But what I'm curious about, for example, is what was the craziest place you had to go to find one of these grave sites?
Craziest place. I guess it's all subjective, but some are not. Some it could be crazy in the sense that how subdued it is per se. I always like to point out President Martin Van Buren is just in the little roadside cemetery of a Dutch Reformed church that if there wasn't a sign, you would never suspect that somebody who was the leader of a country was buried there in that cemetery, just on the side of the road in the little village of Kinderhook, New York. Then some are more over the top. You go to James Garfield's gravesite, and his tomb is just ginormous. It's 180 feet tall, has stained glass windows and a chandelier and terracotta sculptures, and the caskets of James and Lucretia Garfield are just laid out on biers in the crypts. They're not actually interred or buried or anything per se. They're just laid out there if you flipped open the lids. So it's, I wouldn't say there's a crazy location, more so that there's just there's interesting dynamics in how the graves themselves are structured. Some are just so simple and subdued, and some are really extravagant.
Yeah. Was there one in particular that was the most surprising to you? One that really caught you off guard, something you did not expect?
I wouldn't really say that in terms of the presidents because the thing is, I was so well versed in them already before I even went there because I was just absorbing the graves from photos, from the internet, from books that I had, such as Who's Buried in Grant's Tomb by Brian Lamb, the C-SPAN staff, or there was another book that the title exactly is as it exactly is slipping past me right now, but I think it was by Rachel Kochman, and it was about presidential birthplaces and graves and everything. So I was well versed in the details of these grave sites, both visually and verbally described. And so nothing really caught me too off guard. Although I will say that as I got older and understood a little bit more about architecture, just ever so slightly, it was interesting to see how when Abraham Lincoln's tomb was renovated in the 1920s, that it was so Art Deco, which was in vogue at that time. And of course, Art Deco was not something that was around when Abraham Lincoln was around himself. So I would say that was more of a retroactive, caught me off guard kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Was there one that was particularly hard to reach, and any that were difficult to get to?
As far as the presidents, there's some that are open only during warmer weather, such as the Adams presidents and first ladies up in Quincy, Massachusetts, and the interior of James Garfield's tomb as well is open only during warmer weather, as far as the presidents and the first ladies go. For the vice presidents, they could be maybe a little more tricky to find, but one in particular is because he is on private family property, and that is Nelson Rockefeller at the Rockefeller Family Cemetery in Sleepy Hollow, New York. And that's its own chapter in my book. And it's really kind of the white whale for a lot of people who are into this passion or hobby or have this quest of visiting Vice President Rockefeller. And I explain the bizarre circumstances of how I was able to access his gravesite in the book.
Mm, okay. And then I'm curious, was there any spot that you thought was particularly beautiful or peaceful or any sort of maybe favorite for any particular reason?
Well, as far as the surrounding scenery, taking everything into consideration, I think the best view, if you're standing exactly at the president's grave, has to be Ronald Reagan's grave at his presidential library in Simi Valley, California. At the time that I visited with my father in 2008, Nancy Reagan was not yet interred, but she is there now. It just looks over the valley, and it's really incredible. And it's the California scenery. If you stray a little bit from Jefferson's grave at Monticello in Virginia, then you'll see some gorgeous mountains there in the Charlottesville area. So you can't exactly have the perfect view of them when you're standing exactly at his grave. But if you go a little bit farther onto the property, the plantation as a whole, then that might even top the
Mm.
Reagan view from my perspective.
And based on what you learned about the presidents and the vice presidents and the first ladies, was there any that struck you as particularly dissonant? How their graves were marked, where they were interred, etc., versus what they were like in life, what their presidency was like, what they were like as people. I mean, you mentioned Abraham Lincoln's, the architecture didn't match anything that was would have been familiar to him when he was alive. But did you find there were others where there was sort of this disconnect?
Well, I'm just going to go back to Lincoln a second because I would say that beyond the architectural style, the interior, just the overall grandiosity is something that I think is not reflective of Lincoln's tastes and maybe his self-deprecating view of himself. I mean, his grave is also very tall, the 100 foot plus obelisk and all sorts of statuary and quotations, and you can just see it going up the driveway, or the main throughway of the cemetery for such a while. It's just all on its own there. So even beyond the architectural style, that's one that stands out to me. I would also say another example is maybe Warren Harding, because not so much, I guess, who he was per se, but how we remember today. He's best known probably for his administration's role in the Teapot Dome scandal. But a lot of those details did not come out until after he passed away in 1923. So when the media process was happening of fundraising for his elaborate tomb out in Marion, Ohio, for example, school children donated over 200,000 pennies to go towards the construction, the funding of it. And again, that's somebody who today will, oh, wow, that'd be really interesting that this president who was very poorly regarded, that so many people contributed to the construction of his tomb, which is this grand monument of Georgia marble and columns. It's, if you died in office, you got an interesting monument generally, especially the earlier ones. Franklin Roosevelt's is a little more subdued, and of course Kennedy is grand in its own also subdued way. But those early presidents who died in office, the first six, they have some really over the top monuments.
Hmm. How do you think your understanding or appreciation of the office has changed since you started this quest? I mean, are there lessons you have learned or impressions that you have now of the office, the people who have inhabited it? Any sort of takeaways from you now that you're looking back on it?
Oh, absolutely. And some of it is of the journey itself, of course, and some of it is also just being older. When I first got into the presidents, I was 7, and when I first took up this quest in earnest, I was 9 years old, and now I'm an aged 30. And so just the passage of time as well, certainly, and just going along and not only visiting the sites, but reading more, watching more documentaries and everything. Just my lived experience of living through additional presidencies now, not just Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. I would say that it really has shown me how fallible we are as human beings, and how anybody would be if they would be in the office, and that how every president brings in their own lived experiences, their own quirks, idiosyncrasies, and how that influences their policies, how they react to adversity. And also, I feel that the office is, in some ways, it's quite stable, and in some ways, it's quite fragile as well.
When people ask you about this journey, how many years did it take you to complete?
So when I took up the quest officially, it was 2003, and to finish the presidents took me until April 2012. Then I incorporated the vice presidents, and that took me until January of 2014. And then, as we know, it's a continuous position. So that means that there are future continuous passing. So I did have to then go visit George H.W. Bush, who passed away,
Yeah.
and still awaiting the interment of Walter Mondale's ashes 3 years agoing since his passing. But originally about 10, 11 years, if you include the vice presidents.
Yeah. Now that you've done it and you've looked back, is it something you would do again, knowing what you know now? If you were talking to that 9-year-old self of yours, would you say that it was worth doing this trip?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's how I got my job that I have today, in a way, working as an education specialist at historic congressional cemetery. Just even writing the book was a big leg up, I think, in helping me get the job. And I continue to visit the grave sites of many historical and pop culture figures today. I'm around 2,500, actually. So
Mm.
I just am really trying to travel the country and visit all these places and learn as much as I can. And obviously, all started with the presidents, which are still my number one and always will be my number one historical interest. And I'm really grateful for the experiences and, of course, all the journeys with my father in particular, because he was there for all of them. My mother was there as well for some of them, and my sister was there very begrudgingly for some of them. But just the bonding experience with my father as well. So I have no regrets about it whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to ask you, where do you go from here? What do you search for now? And it sounds like you have ideas. How do you prioritize? Do you have a wish list? Do you have do you just start chasing down whatever thing comes along, crosses your path, it starts to interest you, or do you have it laid out? Do you have a spreadsheet? Do you have a list? Do you have goals?
Oh, I have a list. I have them laid out by state, county, or parish, municipality, cemetery, alphabetical by last name, going on. So it's very well organized, my grave list. And I do have some that are higher priority, though. I trying to get all the Supreme Court justices, and I'm currently at 70 graves visited out of the 104 deceased justices. A couple in there are a little tricky because of cremations and some disputed info about where the ashes are currently. But that's a high priority for me right now. I'm also in a competition with my friend TJ Fallon of Dead History on YouTube, and he has about 151 or 152 baseball Hall of Fame graves visited, and I am at 112. So we have a little back and forth with that. So those are two categories that are top of mind right now. But they said I will visit pretty much anybody at this point. Even if I'm around say a sport I don't really care about. Like, I'm not a basketball fan, but I've still found myself at this point going to the graves of 9 basketball Hall of Famers, and I'll just do anything because I'm trying to also just learn a bit, and if I can also help teach people on my website or my the social media, then yeah, I think it's worth expanding my horizons a little bit.
You've written a book about this, obviously, Presidential Grave Hunter. Were you always a writer, or is that something that you have come to because you had all of this information and wanted to do something with it?
Well, going to college and then grad school, you're always doing
Yeah.
writing lots of essays and papers, and that was something that was always one of my strengths. So I wasn't doing it exactly in this fashion, but it is something that that I took to easily and did not dislike. That's for sure. And I continue to write in my job. And I had also, when I was younger, written an article for Horizons, which is the Southern New England AAA publication. So I had some experience, and I'm glad that I've been able to continue that and with the book, do so in a way that it's reached a lot of people and resonated with a lot of people. That very, I've been very grateful to get so many great reviews for the book.
Do you think you have other books in you? Are there other things you want to write about, do you think?
Definitely. It's all a matter of just sitting down and doing it sometimes. But I think that I could write a sequel to Presidential Grave Hunter about the Supreme Court Justice graves and the sometimes wacky adventures that have gone into traveling to see them. And maybe one about my workplace, Historic Congressional Cemetery, could be in the future. And then I have another one that is maybe more of a, I don't want to say a dream project, but it's something that would take a bit to go through, be a little more scholarly on the back burner, and I'm not sure entirely how the concept would be received in certain quarters, but it would be presidential site related.
Hmm. Okay. You were on this journey for a long time. You're still on this journey with respect to chasing down other people, other famous figures. Is there anything you've learned, any lessons you've learned, anything that you have come to appreciate as a result of these quests that you apply to your writing, to your work, to everyday life? Is there any sort of life lessons you've obtained because of this?
I'd say mostly just go for it and do what you want, as long as it's not harming other people, of course. But if you've got a goal, you're only, as they used to say when my generation, when we were younger, it's like you only live once. So don't worry about what other people's opinions are about it. And I know my mission and what's behind it and what I'm trying to get out of it. And sometimes I would prefer to be able to go with friends or my father, but now that I live in Washington D.C. and I'm a ways away from people, sometimes it's either, well, I'm going to go do this alone or I'm not going to do it at all. In that case, I'd rather do it alone, than not at all. So
Yeah.
just trying to live my life and have these adventures while I can.
Good, good. Well, if people want to learn more about you and the adventures and maybe new releases when they come out, where can they go to find you and that information?
People can find me at KD Grave Hunter on Instagram. On YouTube, I'm at Kurt Deion, KurtDeion. And my website is presidentialgravehunter.com.
Excellent.
That's
And if
where
they
they can
want,
also find my book.
okay, I was going to say, if they want to purchase a copy of Presidential Grave Hunter, where's the best place?
So presidentialgravehunter.com if you want a signed copy from me. And then, of course, it's all at all the usual suspects, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. And then you never know, it might be at some historic sites. Just this past week, I signed copies that are for sale at George Washington's Mount Vernon and the National Archives, and the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library has some signed copies. So there are signed copies throughout the country, scattered a bit at some historic sites, particularly president related.
Good. Well, hopefully people will look for those when they're visiting these sites. Kurt, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Presidential Grave Hunter and the other projects that you're working on. We'll look forward to those when they're ready. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Well, thank you, Stacy. Thank you for having me on.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.